Hello there, welcome back to the Rich Fritzky Show. As ever, it's a pleasure to have you with me. Today I return to Boston Common, to the Parkman House, to the old Orpheum Theatre, and to a visit I once had with Mark Twain there, and to the ghosts who reverentially accompanied me on one memorable trudge in more than 2 feet of snow that day. The first of what will be a number of days of old in Boston sojourns. There's a wonderful old 5-story house at 33 Beacon Street at what could be called the holy height of Boston's elitist and Brahmin Beacon Hill, where once upon a time the Cabots spoke only to the lodges and the lodges spoke only to God. In the heart of the historic district, and just yards away from the grounds of the Massachusetts State House, it's the George Francis Parkman Jr. House, and once upon a time I roamed its halls. It had majestic robber baron red brick mahogany and oak flair, and it overlooked Boston Common, the 1634 first park in the colonies, and the Robert Gould Shaw 54th Massachusetts Regiment Monument, the same one pictured as the haunting music and voices of the Harlem Boys Choir resound at the end of the equally haunting movie Glory. Upon Mr. Parkman's death in 1908, he bequeathed both the home and some $5 million, a considerable sum back in those days, to the city of Boston for the care of its neighbor, the Common, and other public parks. The Parkman House offered a vista of the old Park Street Church where William Lloyd Garrison preached those fiery sermons on abolition, and the King's Chapel where the Bradfords and the Winthrops of the Mayflower worshipped, and of the Common Green where the Sons of Liberty once raised quite a ruckus, and upon the graves of the Reveres and the Franklins, upon the very Cradle of Liberty itself. Because the Parkman House was the property of the city of Boston, and I then worked for its mayor, I had ample opportunity not only to be there, but also for a time to actually work from there. But not officially. It was the place where the off-hour, big-picture political stuff got done, and where dreams of Washington and the White House were once upon a time promisingly floated. 3 things had happened to convince Kevin Hagan White, my boss, and the real deal, I might add, then in his second term as mayor of the city of Boston, that he was presidential timber. First, the simple combination of the fact that Senator George McGovern, the Democratic Party's most recent nominee, had actually offered him the vice presidential nomination 2 years earlier, coupled with the fact that Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts ran interference, insisting that McGovern renege. In essence, one man saw his presidential strengths, while ever more importantly, the other feared those strengths. Second, he had developed a rock star's moxie. For not long before, the Rolling Stones, on their way to a performance in Boston Garden, had been arrested for drug possession at a small airport in Connecticut, on a night when the city itself was on edge, in that the demagogues had been doing what demagogues do in fanning the flames of racial dissension, as our president sadly and madly still does today. With 20,000 likely stoned-out Stone fans already at that garden, the mayor got the judge to release them into his personal recognizance, and he went to the Boston Garden to personally temper their rising anger. The city's #1 authority figure, he was booed wildly and understandably upon his introduction, but he played the anger, allowing it to reach its first crushing crescendo before loudly and shrilly saying, "I am afraid that I have bad news for you. The Rolling Stones were arrested in Connecticut on their way to be here with you tonight." Then ever the showman, He pauses, allowing the noise to rise, to tear the house down levels of vitriol. He waits, letting it ascend, before ever more loudly saying, "But I got them out of jail for you." And there it was, the kind of applause known only to rock stars. "I know it's late," he continues, "but they are on their way here now." Pausing again, letting the now recurring waves of applause crash before adding, "Because you're going to be late tonight. I've arranged for the tea to remain open late just to accommodate you. And please now a favor. My city is hurting tonight, and I need my cops on the street and not here. So I'm pulling them all out of here right now, because you're all gonna do me that favor. No fights, no trouble, peace." A conquering hero. He walks off to a sustained and rousing ovation, and for the record, there wasn't a single report of an incident there that night, and nor in his city for that matter. With an audience, Kevin Hagan White was an Irish magician. Third, he was a leader among America's big city mayors. And 76 post-Watergate was to be the year of the Washington outsider, as Jimmy Carter would certainly go on to prove after White bailed out to save his city. But at the dawn of 1974, the Parkman House and not the mayor's office was where the seeds of a presidential campaign were being planted, and I was his communications switch station guy. In this house, Mayor Kevin Hagan White hosted what were prestigious, nationally renowned Parkman House forums on the great domestic issues challenging America and on the tragic lessons of Vietnam. He began his race for the presidency there, not by touring the country, but by inviting political, social, educational, and leaders of all shapes and stripes from all over the country to Parkman House forums, governors, senators, congressmen, and women, university presidents, Nobel laureates, social and humanitarian champions, great news people would all be invited to attend forums on everything and anything from housing to human rights to the environment to social justice to education, etc., etc. And it was my job to keep the flow of communication between the mayor and all forum guests in play. That began with a briefing from him, followed by the immediate drafting of thoughtful, substantive, issue-oriented, personal thank yous to each guest. There would always be a question or two buried within, the point being to drive relationship building, dialogue, belonging, and inevitably delegate counts. The actual forums were in the great old dining hall below, while this, my work, was fashioned on the floor above. And we truly had it going as my mayor's national political star was rising. He was being invited by Parkman House guests who had been moved by him to speak at major events all over the country, from colloquiums to convocations to conventions to graduations, by the governor of Kentucky to the Kentucky Derby and of Indiana to the Indy 500. But it all came crashing down upon the sacrificial altar of force busing to achieve racial integration that September. My fondest memories of the Parkman House are of Saturday afternoons, when all was quiet and I was left to do my work alone in the front parlor on the second floor, the one that overlooked the Boston Common. Now, more than 46 years removed, the memory of the same is still fresh, vivid, vibrant, just as I once was. Back then in my early 20s, I was a wide-eyed believer and dreamer, and there I was living the history that I cherished. As to what I thought I might achieve, it never did get any better than there or then. The snow started falling early that morning, but as my humble and small 34 Commonwealth Avenue apartment was but half a block away from the public garden, it was a brisk and easy walk through the garden and the common to 33 Beacon for me. But as it then proceeded to fall mightily, those expected to join me there that morning understandably begged off. And as night came on and the gaslights beautifully embraced the common at twilight, oh, what a sight to see it was from that parlor window. All of Boston had come to a stop, and I already knew that friends who were to have met me at the Orpheum Theatre, what was just a short stretch of the legs beyond the other side of the common, were highly unlikely to show now. Unsurprisingly, what had been billed as a sold-out production of Hal Holbrook's Mark Twain Tonight was all too true. They indeed had all sold out by staying home. The few of us who actually got there were so very grateful that Holbrook even went on, for oh, what an intimate audience we were. He was wonderful, and rather amazingly, Holbrook went on to perform that show for 63 straight years, before taking that final bow just 3 years ago at the age of 87. 63 years of Twain's Huck battling the immorality and hypocrisy of mankind, battling the immorality and hypocrisy of Americans. 63 years of his concerning the difference between man and the jackass. Some observers hold that there isn't any, but this wrongs the jackass. Or his, there's a good spot tucked away somewhere in everybody, but you'll be a long time finding it more often than not. His God created war so that Americans could learn geography. Or education is the path from cocky ignorance to miserable uncertainty. To his, now suppose you were an idiot, and suppose you were a member of Congress, but I repeat myself. And finally, although there are thousands of them, to that one that speaks to me who pretends to write, the difference between the almost right word and the right word is really a large matter. It's the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. On that memorable February 2nd, 1974 day, it dropped 28.2 inches of snow on downtown Boston. So when I left the Orpheum, Twain and a generous Holbrook behind, and began to trudge through the now 2 feet of snow in a common that appeared to belong to me alone with nary another living soul there, the old gaslights of Beacon Hill, the twinkling lights along the common paths, the glow from the Park Street church steeple, the bright gold dome of the State House, all were lighting the way for me. And in my private communion, each flake of snow seemed to brightly radiate in the lamplight and then gracefully bless and kiss the earth. It was impossible not to be keenly, palpably aware of the beauty of God's creation and of the richness of the city that was, in the silence of that moment, made perfect. Even Gilles Hassam's glorious painting, The Common at Twilight, which I first took notice of, by the way, in a 6th grade art class, and which I would, upon being interviewed by the mayor, be stunned to see hanging right there behind him in his office. No, not even its wonder did justice to capturing all that enveloped me there that night, cold and biting and crisp, but promising and inviting. One couldn't have been more alive. I breathed in the frozen air, exhaled deeply, and became oh so suddenly and mindfully aware of all of those ghosts surrounding me. For there, my friends, there the spiritual presence of all who walked that common's path. Shaw and his men, John Adams and John Hancock and William Lloyd Garrison, John Quincy Adams and Daniel Webster, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David, Longfellow, Hawthorne, Mayor Honey Fitz, Mayor James Michael, Jack and Bobby, all of whom nobly contributed to the great American legacy, that is so sadly being threatened by our leaders in Washington today. Into the teeth of that storm, buoyed by the privilege of working in the Parkman House, by the purpose of the work itself, by time well spent with Hal Holbrook and his Twain, I, no matter the loneliness, walked back to 34 Commonwealth, and inevitably into all that was to follow in the next 46 years of life. But for just a while there and then, oh, so many folks who I revered walked beside me, taken in, as I most certainly was, by the magical mystery of a gaslit common and garden my cup ran over, as their spiritual light burned in me, and in the lingering embers of a once bright, youthful idealism, there they remain. There'll be more to come on Boston soon enough, I assure you. One footnote: whether you've ever been a Mark Twain fan or not, do yourself a favor and get your hands on his The History of a Campaign That Failed. It's relatively unknown for some reason, about his brief service in the Civil War and anti-war to the bone. It's short and it's laugh-out-loud funny from stem to stern. It just might be nice if all troops everywhere followed his lead, in that it would sure take the dying out of war. And wouldn't that be nice? Thanks so much for being with me. Have a great week ahead, and I'll look forward to being back with you next Monday. Take care, my friends.